Hey, Elise, Pickett here with the Urban Harvest, and today we are going to talk about 10 leafy greens for your Florida vegetable garden this summer. Growing leafy greens in your vegetable garden is a wonderful use of space and maximizing the production for your garden. So not only do they typically take up very little room, but those are also the greens and vegetables that lose their nutrients the quickest. Take for example spinach. It loses 90% of its vitamin C in the first 24 hours after harvest. So if we have things that we can grow in our own yards and pick fresh to use for salads or smoothies or cooking greens, I would rather spend our effort on things that lose their nutrition the quickest than things that do hold their nutritional value a little bit better. That's why I'm a huge proponent for growing your own leafy greens. I teach a lot of classes on the subject. I've got one coming up on 30 different leafy greens you can grow for year-round greens here in Florida. But today I wanted to focus in on a summer vegetable garden. 10 leafy greens that you can grow all the way through our summer months so that you can have production when things are usually slim pickings. As you can see here, the lettuce, which is typically what we would be thinking of when we think of leafy greens, is about done. It is in April now and it has been heating up quite quickly, so these are going to seed soon. They're getting much more bitter in flavor and it's just past prime. But today we're going to talk about other leafy greens, alternative leafy greens, that grow just as well here in Florida in the heat. Swiss chard is one of those leafy greens that does exceptionally well considering the heat. Most people lump Swiss chard in with kale and whatnot, but it is actually much more heat tolerant than many of those other crops. It's technically in the beet family, but the leafy greens really do hold up quite well to the hot temperatures. You can see here that I have Swiss chard just starting to come in, which is perfect timing considering the lettuce is starting to fade out, as is the kale. So it'll kind of take their place in my salad mixes. You can pick it young for tender leaves, using them in salads and whatnot, or you can let them mature to full size and use them as a cooking green. There are a few different varieties. Typically you'll see a lot of the rainbow chard, which has the gorgeous colored stems you see here, the yellows and reds and everything like that. Or you can grow Ford Hook Swiss chard, which I'm a huge fan of. It's much larger. The stalks are a pale yellowish white, but the stalks are so big on them you can actually use them as a celery substitute, which is quite nice. And they do much better as a cooking green as opposed to the rainbow chard, which you can use as a salad mix. I always plant both in my garden. I really enjoy the taste of Swiss chard. Some people do find it a little bit bitter, but the younger you pick it, the less bitter it is going to be. Collard greens are another great crop that, if established prior to the summer months, does quite well holding into those summer months. It's a southern crop for a reason. It takes our sandy soil and the heat quite well. Collard greens are not for everybody. I happen to love them, but I am from the South and I grew up eating them. You can use them as a cooking green, which is most common, but you can also do Brazilian collards where they saute them, or you can even lightly steam them and use them as wraps for sandwiches. So quite diverse, even though most people immediately think of just the slow cooked boiling method. Collard greens do have some issues with pests over the summer months, but it's usually quite easily managed, and they are so prolific once they start going that most people just get sick of eating the collard greens and rip them out because they're just done with it. In my book, it's not such a bad thing to have something that produces in so much abundance that you get sick of it. So I always plant some. If you're looking for a little bit more compact of a variety, Vates is a really good option. It doesn't have as big of leaves, but it fits in small spaces and containers. If you're looking for more of the traditional collard green, you would probably go with a Georgia Southern. There's a ton of different varieties that do really well here. Great option for a summer vegetable garden crop. Amaranth here is a leafy green that I've been using consistently in my garden now for probably 10 plus years. It is incredibly resilient. It self-seeds itself, so once you put some in a bed, you likely won't have to reseed it the following season. It takes our summer heat here in our Florida climate exceptionally well. It has very little pests issues and needs no water. You can't ask for much more than that. The leaves are edible, so that is our leafy green, why it's considered in this video for one of the top 10 leafy greens for summer vegetable gardens. But it also has beautiful flowers, and as an added bonus, you can actually harvest the grain, which is similar in size to couscous, but it's a whole grain. It's very easily digested, it's gluten-free. A lot of people actually consider it the warm weather quinoa. So amaranth, also known as callaloo in some locations, is a wonderful leafy green to incorporate into your garden. It grows so well that it's actually considered a weed in many places, but in my book, when it has so many benefits going for it, how could it possibly be considered a weed? Egyptian spinach is another leafy green, an annual leafy green that does great here in our summers. It won't even consider popping up until it is nice and consistently warm, but it holds so well all the way through our summer months until we start to get our cooler temperatures in fall. It becomes a small bush, probably 4 feet or so high, not very wide, maybe 2 feet wide, and it has these beautiful little serrated leaves. They can be used raw in salads or smoothies or cooked, although they do cook down quite a bit, so you'd need a substantial amount to really get much out of it for that purpose. They're a nice mild taste. It's something that is very easy to care for over the summer months with hardly any pest issues or otherwise. They get delicate little flowers, which the pollinators seem to really love, so it's a great addition to your summer vegetable garden. Of course, no summer leafy greens video would be complete without sweet potatoes. Everybody plants the sweet potatoes for the roots, but I've mentioned in other videos as well, the leafy greens are edible and quite delicious as well. They do have a little bit of a tougher texture if you use the mature leaves, so usually the last couple inches on the leaf tips are good, the fresh new growth. It is delicious. You can use them fresh in salads or you can cook them down. They hold their form pretty well, so they can be used for both purposes. Very mild flavor, so they don't overpower or overwhelm a salad or anything else you may be using it for. And they are just so darn prolific that you almost can't harvest them fast enough. So it is just a no-brainer to incorporate them somewhere in your garden. It's a lovely cover crop. I do have a video on cover crops for your summer vegetable garden if you're not looking to actively garden over the summer months. And sweet potato is one of those crops that you can let go. You don't need to water, you don't need to monitor for pests. It's going to produce those root crops for you that you can harvest come fall. And while you're at it over the summer months, you can go out as needed and harvest the leafy greens. This truly is one of the ideal crops for growing here in Florida. Ethiopian kale is a well-known leafy green in a lot of permaculture circles. It is close to a perennial leafy green, especially here in summer, if you offer it some afternoon shade or part shade conditions. It is extremely heat tolerant for most kale varieties and does much better than any other variety of kale you could possibly find. But it is a little tricky to source the seeds, which is rather unfortunate because it is a wonderful leafy green to grow in your Florida vegetable garden. So if you can find the seed, this is a must plant. You can plant it year round, but it really excels and shines in the warmer temperatures. It will go to flower and seed quite quickly, but you just continue to succession plant it, especially in the shade during our warmer months, and it will be a reliable leafy green for you to depend on. A lot of people ask me what the flavor is like on Ethiopian kale, and I would say it's kind of a mix between kale and mustard greens. So it's definitely got a nice peppery kick to it, but the leaves are quite tender and succulent, which is really, really nice. You can pick them young and use them raw, but most people tend to saute them or use them for cooking. Next up is Chaya. Now we're getting into the good stuff. This is actually a perennial leafy green for Florida, a perennial leafy green. That means it's going to grow year round for you and be a reliable and consistent source of leafy greens no matter the time of year. It does slow down a little bit in the winter. If it's exposed to a freeze, it can die back, but it will pop back afterwards. But if you plant it on the southern side of your house or in a little niche microclimate where it gets a little bit of protection, it will produce for you year round. Now, these are incredibly easy to grow. They're not very picky as to where you plant them or anything like that, but they do prefer sunlight and, if possible, a little bit of a richer soil. But that being said, you can plant it right in the ground and it will also do just fine. There is one caveat with Chaya, and that is that it has cyanide in it. That might sound incredibly scary. It is not bad at all. It's perfectly safe to eat and it is used worldwide as a food source. But you do have to cook the greens for them to be safe to consume. This is not a plant that you will eat raw. All you have to do to cook it is boiling it for 3 minutes, and the cyanide off gases and is no longer in your food. It is perfectly safe to eat. You can use the water or sauce that it was used to cook or boil in. All of that is perfectly fine. And they are quite tasty as well. They don't, sometimes when you cook like spinach and stuff, it just kind of dissipates into nothing. You start with a whole pan and then you end up with a small handful. Chaya holds its shape pretty well, so it'll be a nice substantial filling meal for you. And it's a wonderful summer crop that you can depend on for leafy greens. This here is longevity spinach. Longevity spinach is a really nice ground cover. It is also a perennial leafy green here in Florida. It forms a kind of low crawling couple inch high mat. It works really good around fruit trees or any sort of perennial crops that you have that you would like to protect the soil for, and still have something edible for you to harvest. You can use them fresh, raw, or cooked, but they tend to do quite a bit better raw again. And they have more of a succulent taste to them, so they've got a nice crunchy leaf, which is really, really tasty. And they are just so incredibly productive that there is no reason not to have a little bit of this in the garden. They are quite easy to grow. All you need is a little bit of afternoon shade if you want them to continue producing all the way through summer, which is why I like to plant them in and around some of my taller, more mature perennials, just because it does tend to offer a little bit of shade during the day for them. Surinam spinach, also known as Ceylon spinach, is another perennial leafy green here in Florida. Now this plant here is looking a little bit haggard, but it's gone all the way through our winter months with zero attention or care from me. and it's popping back now that we're starting to get a little bit warmer. Just like the Chaya, it will slow down a little bit over the winter months, but it does still produce the entire time. We've been picking for our salads and smoothies and throwing in a handful consistently all winter long, and now it's going to do even better coming into the summer months. The leaves are best raw, not cooked. They cook down to almost nothing when they're sauteed or put into any sort of soups. So we typically use them just raw in salads or smoothies. They have a nice, almost lemony flavor to them. And they also have beautiful little pink purple flowers, which are edible. So those are always pretty and nice to be able to toss into the salads. Very easy to grow, very low maintenance, and they will self-seed readily. So you will soon have your entire garden full of it if you want it to. But they're also easy enough to remove by just pulling out. This is Katuk, and it is a wonderful leafy green for summer here in Florida. It is originally from Southeast Asia in the tropics there, so it is used to the heat and humidity, and it does exceedingly well in it. The other bonus is that this actually prefers part shade. So a lot of crops that we grow for our food consumption need more sun. This one actually thrives in part shade. Katuk is a really nutrient-dense leafy green. It kind of tastes like a mix between peas and peanuts, maybe? It's kind of got a little bit of a nutty flavor mixed with peas. It's quite tasty. It's typically eaten fresh, and if you plant it in rich, moist soil, the shoots tend to get really long, and in Hawaii, they actually use it as an asparagus alternative. It's called tropical asparagus. So multiple uses for this plant. Not only can you eat the leafy greens, which are quite tasty, but you can also eat the shoots. It's quite easy to grow and very flexible with its growing conditions. It's typically sourced from cuttings, so check with some of your local resources, as this seed is typically a little bit longer to start and harder to source or find a quality source of. So ask around, see if there's anybody in your gardening clubs or in the area that has Katuk that would be willing to share some cuttings with you. It takes quite well from cuttings, and it is a great perennial leafy green for here in Florida. This video is about growing leafy greens over the summer months. So why do I have so many perennial leafy greens? It's really important to try to incorporate perennials into your garden because they're going to be there consistently and more reliably than a lot of our annual crops. So I always try to have some perennials growing in addition to the annual leafy greens, because this is something that I can always fall back on. If I forget to succession plant some of my greens and some of them bolt and they're all gone, or if a pest comes through and knocks out whatever I have growing, my collard greens, I have something that I know is going to be in my landscape that I can fall back on so that I don't have to go to the grocery store if I don't want to. So far this year, I haven't purchased any leafy greens other than what I've grown, and I couldn't be happier with this decision. It's made me much more aware of what I have access to and trying to incorporate all sorts of different varieties so that I have that continual production that I'm hoping for. I've been a little light on some of my crops at some times, but that just allows me to focus and really put my effort into succession planting and thinking about the different seasons and the different crops. The perennial leafy greens that I have that I know I can rely on have definitely pulled me through when some of my annual crops have been in between. We use salads and smoothies almost daily, so leafy greens are a really important part of our diet, and I've loved incorporating some of the perennials into our meals. If you want to learn more about perennial vegetables and perennial leafy greens to incorporate into your garden, I highly recommend the book Perennial Vegetables by Eric Tonsmeyer. It is a wonderful resource for anybody who is looking to incorporate a little bit more consistency and dependability into their vegetable garden. It covers a wide variety of crops for the entire United States, as well as about half the crops which can grow here in Florida. If you'd like to find that book, I do have a link below. By purchasing through that link, you do help support the work that I do here on the channel and teaching others about vegetable gardening here in Florida. Growing leafy greens is such a wonderful way for you to provide nutrition and food for your family, regardless of whether you're growing in a small space or a large garden. Anybody can grow leafy greens here in Florida. I often teach classes on how to grow leafy greens year-round here in Florida. I do have one class coming up, so if you're interested in that, head on down to the show notes where you will find the information to register for that class. We'll be going over 30 different varieties of leafy greens that you can grow year-round here in Florida, of course, as a webinar considering things going on. I hope you found this video informative and helpful. If you are interested in learning any more about perennial vegetables, other summer crops to grow in your Florida vegetable garden, or any other topics that you'd like to see covered here on the channel, make sure to leave me a comment below. I'm trying to get to as many topics as possible as soon as possible. While you're down there, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you're alerted every time a video comes out on Florida-based vegetable gardening. Happy gardening!